Thank you for your patience and looking forward to your feedback. I'm giving this talk for the third time. Actually, I've lost count of how many times. I first gave it in 1990. It was 45 minutes then. I've learned a lot about wargaming since. So when I try to give a talk on wargaming, I either have to cut a lot out or it's pretty much 2 hours. And we wanted to have time for questions and answers. So we needed to condense it and cut out something. And in the past, I would do wargaming before World War II or after World War II or war games that changed history. Well, in talking to Sebastian, but we came up with the idea that maybe we should focus on the most valuable players, the individuals that had the biggest impact on wargaming. And so, and I thought it was a good idea at the time, but the more I thought, the idea got better and better. For example, the book Patton Mind really got me thinking about why this might be a good idea. You see, Patton is a kind of interesting person. Nye, in working on the book, discovered a mystery. First of all, Patton was really rich. I mean, he was really, really rich. And if he wanted a book, he bought it. Never got books out of the library. If he thought somebody should get a book, he'd give them a book, he'd buy a new copy of the book and keep the original. He would sign and date each book when he first started reading it, and then date it when he completed it. And so when Nye went in to do the book, he looked through all of Patton's stuff and was able to tabulate how many books he read each year, how many pages he read each year, which book he read which year, what were the types of books he read. And he discovered something that was very curious. And that is, while Patton spoke and wrote and displayed leadership, he finished very few books on leadership, started very few. They tended to be gifts from other people, and he tended not to finish them. So where did he come up with all this stuff to practice and lead? And what he finally figured out was the answer was that Patton read a great deal of biographies of great leaders. And Patton was deciding for himself what were those things that made those great leaders great. Well, I also started thinking about Napoleon and one of his keys to leadership. Napoleon had many innovations, but one of them was he really brought the whole ideas of military decorations kind of up to the current day. Not exactly, but if you look at ribbons before Napoleon and after, it was really the big deflection point. He gave them out a lot. And when asked why, he would give two reasons. One, it was the right thing to do. But two, it inspired the soldiers decorated, the comrades of the soldiers that he was decorating. And this is a trick that leaders have known for a great many years. So when I think about why we should have a presentation dedicated to wargaming's MVPs, I think we have three basic reasons. One, it's the right thing to do. I'm infamous or famous for saying that wargames save lives. Well, if they save lives, then those people that contributed to this field and enabled them to be effective deserve some recognition. But over and above that, we can learn from them. What was it that they did that made them so effective in wargaming? And then finally, I think they can also inspire us. When we get kind of discouraged and people don't always do what we want to do as quick as we want them to do it, we can look back at the times that people before us worked and worked and worked and finally broke through and had some success. So let's go back to the beginning. And in the very beginning, we don't know of any most valuable players because war games occurred after the beginning of civilization, but before the beginning of history. Civilization is the rise of cities, begins with the rise of cities. History starts with writing because you need a written record for your history. And war games started so early, they started before written writing in the very first histories. Interestingly, they were abstract war games, and they were only found in the tombs and the homes and the palaces of the rulers. And the inference is that these were created as training tools for the children of the rulers, so they could develop downboard thinking, they could develop the ability to outthink the sons of the other kings and emperors and pharaohs. Well, as we move forward, we get to, okay, as we try to move forward, okay, we get to the opportunity to go from abstract games to more simulation games. And that occurs as we're starting to get to the modern period. You start having to scale maps, you start having a better understanding of probability and statistics. Modeling is used to anticipate outcomes in naval combat. And chess games are becoming less and less like, there's versions of chess that become less and less like chess and more like modern war games, but they all have the I move, you move, I move complete intelligence of a chess game. Now, there's a lot of agreement on who invented modern wargaming. And if I can get to that slide, I will tell you. Well, first, before that, thank you. We have, so we have opportunity by the new technologies and techniques that would enable a more simulation war game, but we needed a motive to move in that direction. And Napoleon's conquest provided that motive. The key to Napoleon's success was not technology. You know, my day job is to work at a research lab, and so I'm very pro technology. But particularly his early victories, Napoleon had the same technology as the kings before him. A lot of it was his individual genius. A lot of it was the meritocracy, where if you're in an ancient regime, your generals were your children. If the prince was smart, great. If the prince was an idiot, he was still in charge. Well, in the case of Napoleon, half of his marshals started out as enlisted men. And there was also the question of numbers, because the ancient regimes could only have as many soldiers as they could pay. Because Napoleon had hijacked the revolution, he had a lot more people. Well, the kings like being kings, so how are we going to counter Napoleon? And part of that is to try to get a little more genius on your side. So Herr Reisswitz, the father, invents this war game that seems a lot like a modern war game. You have two sides with limited intelligence. You have a map in the middle, actually a 3D terrain table in the middle. Both sides come up with their moves. Both sides are told only what they would know. Random dice were used to create a little bit more of the friction and uncertainty of war. And Reisswitz demonstrated this to the King of Prussia, and the King of Prussia enthusiastically adopted it, but he still used it the way that kings and pharaohs had always used war games to train. He used it to train his sons in war. So this is not unusual. You know, one of the things Chris Weave and I talk about from time to time is about how new inventions tend to be used to do old things better before they're really used to their greatest benefit. And their greatest benefit, the move towards that, was started by Reisswitz's son. Now, we had talked about Lieutenant, later Captain Reisswitz. Now, we had talked about how Napoleon had several advantages. This modern wargaming could help with genius just a bit, better trained commanders. Numbers was nationalism, that instead of just getting how many people you could pay, a lot of the ancient regimes will say, we need to get rid of those French, we Germans need to get rid of those guys. Don't listen to this democracy stuff, but we need to do that. And because of the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, and nationalism, Royal Armies got bigger and bigger, and there wasn't enough sons of officers to fill all the billets. And so they started allowing into the officer corps children of mere cabinet officials and bankers and industrialists. And it was shocking. And one of those new officers was Lieutenant Reisswitz. And he discovered something rather disturbing, that officership in the military was almost kind of like a guild. You tended to learn your profession at your father's knee. And there's all these cases in particularly medieval history where you have reports of the future king such and such on the battlefield of some famous battle, and you do the math of when the battle took place and when he was born, and he was on the battlefield at 14, 8, 12. There's Metropolitan Museum of Art, a set of armor that's like 3 feet tall, because if the prince heir is out in the battlefield, you want to make sure he's safe. Well, Lieutenant Reisswitz didn't learn war on his father's knee, but he knew about his father's game. But he also knew that the King of Prussia was cheap, and that he wouldn't pay for the big elaborate piece of furniture that was the one copy of Herr Reisswitz Wargame. So the good lieutenant figured out how the wargame could be played with any topographical map, and instead of having all the pieces painted in the colors of each of the Prussian regiments, he had one side that was red and the other side that was blue. So red and blue go all the way back to 1842. And they were demonstrating this to the Chief of Staff of the Prussian Armed Forces. And famously, the Chief of Staff said, "This is not a game at all. This is training for war. I shall recommend it to all our regiments." Well, he didn't recommend it, he ordered it. They had to play war games during the winter when officers normally had more free time. The good lieutenant did make captain, but he was sent off to a garrison and was very unpopular, and he committed suicide. So in the future, if you get negative feedback on any of your endeavors, just keep in mind it could be much worse. But not everybody disliked what Reisswitz was doing. In fact, there was a handsome young person, and I have no idea why this acts up sometimes and not others. I think I skipped a slide. Let me go back. Yeah, here we go. The handsome young gentleman by the name of Himmet von Melke, who was one of these officers that was a big fan of wargaming. So he founded a wargaming club in Mecklenburg when he was still a captain. He joined the wargaming club in Berlin when he got transferred to Berlin. And when he took over as Chief of Staff, he ordered an increase in wargaming. And he discovered something that generals have been discovering for a long, long time. Issuing an order and having that order carried out is not always the same thing. So Melke was very smart, and he figured out a way to get people to want to play more war games. Now, we talked about Napoleon's advantages, and one of them was the meritocracy. Well, Prussia wanted its armed forces to be effective, but it's good to be king. And, you have to have jobs to keep your sons busy, but you also, this meritocracy stuff's pretty good too. So what Prussia came up with was this whole general staff system where you would have the commander who was a von, who was a prince or something else, but then every commander would, or every person from a corps and above would have a general staff officer, and the general staff officer would be appointed based on merit, with how well he did in the war college, how well he did after war college. And there were two ways to make general officer in the Prussian Armed Forces. One was to have the king as your father, and the other was to be a graduate of the staff college. Now, this is being done over the air. Typically at this point when I'm giving this briefing, I ask for a show of hands of how many people have a parent who's one of the crown heads of Europe. I've given this talk so many times, I was giving it to a room full of Saudi Arabians once, and I said, "Now raise hand. How many people have parents as a a king or something?" And I'm like, "Oh, probably not the right thing to say in this audience." Fortunately, nobody raised their hand. But anyway, so if you come from even not all that humble of background, if you want to make general officer, you better get into the staff, the war college. Well, Moltke decreed that every application of somebody going into the staff college had to include a letter of evaluation from the garrison commander on how well this guy did as the senior umpire for a war game. And there can only be one senior umpire per war game. So every time that garrison wanted to send an applicant for consideration of the war college, they needed to play a war game. And then once Moltke got them into the staff college, the wargaming continued. Hopefully the slides will continue too. So basically, okay, there seems to be a time delay. Maybe I need to be just be more patient. So Moltke came up with this idea called staff rides. Now, sometimes our war college will have what they call a staff ride. They all get in a bus. They go down to Gettysburg. A historian gets on the bus. They tour the battlefield, and he tells them ghost stories and anecdotes and stuff, and then they go back up to Carlisle. This was very different. The student body of the war college, and as much of the general staff as could be spared, physically went to one of the invasion corridors of Prussia. Then they would ride up to a hillside and they would look at the potential battlefield, and Moltke would turn to the group and say, okay, Austria could mobilize this many people with this much of notice to come against us from that direction between the garrison that's here, it's an invasion corridor, plus the amount of troops we could get here, given the warning we would likely have, we would have this many troops in this area. And then Moltke would turn to the youngest person in attendance and ask them what they thought the Prussian disposition should be. And again, when this is a live audience, I would ask, why would they think that was? And I would get a lot of different answers. And eventually somebody would say, well, if you ask the youngest guy, A, you're probably going to get more creative ideas, and B, he's not going to be intimidated, not wanting to disagree with somebody more senior, because if he speaks first, nobody more senior has spoken. And Moltke was very careful about this. He would always ask people for their opinions in the reverse order of seniority. And then once all that went on, so once they did that, they'd go to another part of the battlefield, talk through the next part of the battle, and then they would go to the local garrison or a local tavern, and they would lay out the topographical maps, and they would conduct a conventional war game. Only now Moltke would split them in half, and he would get one of the most senior Prussian generals and put him in charge of red. And he would do that because he said, I don't know how smart of an officer the Austrians or the French or whoever would send against us, but I know they could be no smarter than General such and such. So if we can win the fight against General such and such, then we're in good shape. And then they would get the second most senior guy, put him in charge of the Prussians, third, fourth. So both teams were equally balanced. And then they would conduct the conventional war game like Lieutenant Reisswitz designed. And then they weren't done. Because it was an invasion corridor, there'd be a garrison close by, and they'd go, okay, in our war game, we marched 6,000 troops from here to here, and it took this much time. Mr. Garrison Commander, or Colonel Garrison Commander, I want you to take 600 troops, march from here to here, and tell us how long it takes. And they would actually test out parts of their plan with actual men. And I wonder if this is where field exercises arose from. Anyway, he still wasn't done, because when they went back to Berlin, this became an on-the-shelf plan for an invasion, actual invasion along that corridor. So if you think about it, it starts with an offsite away from Berlin, then they do brainstorming, then they war game it out, then they have a live exercise, and then it becomes a deliberate plan. And we're talking like the 1860s, 1870s, 1850s. Isn't it a shame how primitive things were back then? So very, very sophisticated stuff. Now, Prussia and Germany win a lot of wars they shouldn't have won. Against Denmark, when it was a much bigger country, against Austria, when it was a much bigger country, against France, the grandchildren of Napoleon. And they not only won, but they won fast. And a lot of experts at the time attributed it to their staff procedures. And at the core of their staff procedures was wargaming. So a lot of other countries started copying wargaming. And so to save time, I'm going to click through this list pretty quickly. Some of you may notice there is a correlation between the year a country starts doing wargaming and the year they're defeated by Prussia or Germany. Now, when we go to the United States, we have, again, one of the most valuable players, a gentleman who at the time was a Major Livermore. And he tried very hard to get the Army to adopt wargaming. And at first there was a lot of resistance. The Chief of Staff of the Army felt that you could over-intellectualize this. You needed to spend time with the troops. And so Major Livermore decided, okay, what I'll do is I'll set up a war game for a battle of the Civil War and fight it out. And if you come up with the same outcomes, then that will kind of show the Army leadership that stuff works. Well, he did that, and there wasn't enough casualties. And the Germans had come up with their casualty tables based on the smoothbore muskets they had when these games were developed. Well, Civil War, you have rifled muskets, a lot more lethal. So he actually went back and re-engineered the combat results table so that it reflected having rifled muskets, went back and refought the Civil War battles, and the outcomes were very similar to what took place during the actual Civil War battles. And so that helped them get a lot more accepted. Articles were written, he made colonel, which is not always easy. And so a fair amount of acceptance, but then in the 1990s, Major Sayer and others at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College start writing and saying, we have so much respect for Colonel Livermore, and what he's trying to do is so noble, but this is not Prussia. We do not have these big garrisons. We've got all these cavalry posts scattered throughout the West. We have all these coastal fortifications at big ports and small. We have very few places where there's a bunch of Army guys in one place. And so there's not going to be the expertise to really do wargaming the way that Colonel Livermore feels it should be done. So we at the Army Command and General Staff College has set up this crawl, walk, run system where we start off with a map exercise where you have a scripted read, and every student comes up with a solution. And then we have a two-sided map maneuver where, again, it's what we would call a war game. You have students playing against students and see how it works. Then they actually go out in the field and try to execute the plans they come up with, but one-sided. And then you have field maneuvers of the two sides working against each other. And it's a very logical progression, a very useful progression. And it really helped us go to World War I with officers that were much better trained in this. We were successful in the Spanish-American War because we did a good job of picking an adversary. There was a lot of problems with staffing and planning and all the rest, much better by Europe. And not all of it can be attributed to the Command General Staff College's use of wargaming, but a big part of it can. Now we move forward with patience because it seems to be a little bit of a delay. I don't want to go too far. Here we go. Now, when we talk about history, wargaming's most valuable players, it would be tough to come up with anybody more valuable than the one that is not like all the others. This is the faculty of the Naval War College very early in its existence. And if you notice, there's this one guy that isn't dressed quite like the rest of them. And his name is McCarty Little. And he was medically retired from the Navy shortly after the Civil War. He had a great career up to that point. There are different sources say that it was kind of bogus, kicking him out, trying to get the size of the Navy down. Others say no, it was legit. But he was living on his medical retired pay in Newport, Rhode Island, right next door to where the Navy decided to build their war college. And without getting any money in addition to what he was going to get just to sit in his house from his retirement pay, he organized the War College library. He came up with a number of lectures, and almost single-handedly, he established the wargaming part of the curriculum. And so from 1886 on, the Naval War College has been conducting wargaming. Well, this is one of the happy ending stories with wargaming MVP, because after he did this for like 20 years, a special act was passed through Congress, increasing his retired rank to captain. And so Captain McCarty Little started receiving retirement, his medically retired pay, as if he was retired as a captain, in recognition for all those years he had done so much. And this guy really is brilliant. I like to try to trace back footnotes when I can, and there were several references and writings on him about this brilliant paper he wrote in like 1914, shortly before his death. And I read it years ago, and I'm like, my God, he's talking about effects-based operations. He's talking about OODA loops. He's using different terminologies, but he's talking about stuff that isn't going to become kind of commonly accepted for decades to come. So a brilliant, brilliant individual who had a big impact and was ultimately recognized for that impact. Now, we also have civilians making contributions to wargaming, and part of that is to motivate people to want to learn about war and wargaming. And one of those is a guy by the name of Wilkinson, who on vacation read this little booklet about the armies of Europe and saw that the British, his nation, his home nation, had one of the smallest armies on the continent. And he felt that was dangerous and wrong, and he started a one-man campaign to try to build up the capabilities of the British military. And part of that was translating and adopting the German method of wargaming, which he then tried to promote, and we'll talk about him succeeding on that later. Another guy is in Germany is a guy by the name of Hans Delbrück. Now, if any of you are history majors, that name might sound pretty familiar. Many people attribute to him, consider him the father of modern military history. A lot of military history up to that point was very much drums and thunder. It was, Caesar, did all this brilliant stuff. Delbrück used what he learned as a reserve staff officer to look at the historical reports critically. And he did more than that, but we'll get to that later in the talk. Now, this gentleman also had a lot to do with bringing wargaming to civilian marketplace, because he came up with a civilian naval wargame. And it was the first crossover where it was popular among serving naval officers, and it was popular among the civilian population. But he discovered something that all authors discover. Royalties tend to come in a spike. When a book is first published, you get most royalties. In fact, the somewhat tongue-in-cheek rule is that half of all the royalty money you're ever going to see is in the first check. And half of all the money you're going to see after the first check is in the second check. And half of all the money you're going to see after the third check is in the third check. So his rules are pretty popular, but he only had 60, and they were very detailed. You needed these very detailed outlines of the ship with how thick the armor was, and what were the guns and all this other stuff. And so when you're playing the game, you'd only have these 6 ships that can fight against each other. So as a supplement, he came out with this book that was all His Majesty's warships. And so now you had lots and lots of different ships that you could fight against each other. And that's pretty good, but they're all British ships. So what's the fun of that? So then he came up with a supplement to his war game called On All the Ships of the German Imperial High Seas Fleet. Well, turns out political correctness is not native to this century or even the last. There was this hue and outcry. How dare you imply that someday we may fight our good friends, the Germans? I mean, they're our biggest trading partner. We could never, Great Britain and Germany could never conceivably go to war against each other. Why are these the guys that you're coming out with a supplement for? So he learned his lesson, and the next time he came up with a supplement to his war game, he called it All the World's Warships. You're looking at a picture of Tom Jane's, and Jane's fighting ships, Jane's all the world aircraft, Jane's all the world vending machines. A significant percentage of the British gross national product, or at least their exchange earnings, come from what started out as a supplement to a war game. Now here's, when it comes up, another name you might recognize, but it's arguably the first ground combat war game. And this is most of the cover of the book. It was called Little Wars. And the gentleman to the lower left-hand side is, it's a self-portrait of the author. And Little Wars was written as an act of pacifism. He said that the world is evolving towards democracy. War is so terrible. So my game is going to help people see just how terrible war is, and they'll make sure their politicians don't go to war. Well, he was wrong. The book came out, the war game came out in 1913, so it was at least not initially accurate, but some of the things he predicted did come true sooner or later. That gentleman you see on the left is H.G. Wells, and he did make quite a few predictions. Okay, keep going. I'm trying to go quickly, but not skip slides by doing too much. Okay, we get to the build up to the Great War, and in 1905, there were war games that shaped the world. Okay, the 2 war games played in 1905 by just stroke of luck depicted the same situation and the same outcome, but resulted in very different actions. 1905 was the year that General Schlieffen was retiring as the chief of the German General Staff. And in his last staff ride, his last big annual war game, they concentrated against the Russians first, defeated the Russians, turned the army around, came to defeat the French, but while the bulk of the army was fighting the Russians, the French had invaded through Belgium, and they were coming into Germany in an area that Germany had not really fortified. So the Germans showed up in the nick of time, pushed the French back out of Belgium, deep into France, basically annihilated the French army by not beating themselves up against the French fortifications. And Schlieffen was like, why don't we just start with the French? Why don't we invade through Brussels, through Belgium? You know, I was always curious why Schlieffen kept advocating this plan even in retirement, and he had been the chief of staff. Wasn't this the plan on the books? And the answer was no, that he came up with this idea as he was retiring. So like so many generals today giving advice to the people that replaced them, he was trying to convince his successors to do this. Well, also in 1905, Wilkinson, remember that Brit that was advocating the British use of wargaming? He played a war game. And in his war game, the Germans didn't bother with the Russians. They just attacked through Belgium, swung around through Belgium, trapped the French army against their own forts, totally annihilated it before the British could get across the channel and intervene. Well, Schlieffen kind of liked the outcome of his war game. The British didn't like the outcome of their war game at all. So the Brits still officially maintained their neutrality, at least for a while, but they started having discussions between faculties of their staff college. They redid their mobility plan. And the Brits got to the continent way faster than the Germans expected or the French expected. And if you know anything about the Battle of the Marne, one reason it turned out the way it did is that the British Expeditionary Force was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and really started resulting in the unraveling of the German plan. Now, in 1910, you also have Monkey the Younger doing a lot of things right and making a real difference, but it wasn't enough of a difference. When the Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm took over, well, again, I've given this talk so many times. I would often say that my personal opinion is that Germany and the world would be better off if Kaiser Wilhelm died at birth. I was careful not to say this. I've given this talk twice at the German War College. I made sure not to say that either time in case there were any loyalists in the audience. But this guy thought he was the reincarnation of Julius Caesar and Napoleon and Alexander the Great, and he knew everything. So they would go on these staff rides, and the king would say, oh, this is a simple problem. We should put these troops here, these troops there, you know, move those folks over there. Well, very little debate after the king says all that. So Monkey knew the king since they were both children. He went to them and said, you know, sir, your people love you. Have you ever noticed the year you play French, the French one? They don't want to do anything to hurt your feelings or to disagree with you. So when you come to these staff rides, you know, please talk about politics and sex and religion and, you know, whatever you want, but please don't comment on military strategy. And the Kaiser agreed. And then Monkey also was looking at the big war games, and he said, there are no machine guns in these war games. And his staff said, well, we don't really have any data, so rather than getting it wrong, we've left them out. And Monkey says, wrong answer, get some attaches over to the Russian-Japanese war. I want machine guns in our war game the next year. And the war game started to help them learn how to employ machine guns effectively. So by the time of World War I, not only were they using machine guns more effectively, they had more machine guns at a lower level than any of the other militaries. And then finally, just a year before World War I, he went to his people, his staff, and said, you know, there are no logistics in this game, and marching through Belgium like that is going to be a bear on logistics. I think we should do it next time. And they're, oh, it's too hard, we can't do it, it's too complicated, you know, just, and he says, you know, I've heard that the Italian War College has had logistics in their war games since 1888. Are you telling me that the Italians are smarter than us Germans? And the next year they had logistics, and the play of logistics showed that the Germans still won, but they had a day of ammunition left after the French surrendered. And Monkey's like, you know, I'm a big believer in war games, but they're kind of approximate. And what if we run out of ammunition the day before the war is over? You know, we'd have a problem here. And so Monkey directed the creation of the first motorized unit of any military anywhere in the world. They weren't panzers, they weren't Panzer Grenadier, they were supply trucks. And so did a lot of stuff right, but not enough. Now, the next one, the next item, if it goes to the next item, is one that we're going to skip and come back, and you'll have to read the book on. But there was a, see, we went too far. Yeah, 1914, the war game that didn't change history. Read the book. Okay, now we get to wargaming during the Great War, and we mentioned how wargaming had provided such an advantage to the Prussians and then to the Germans. Well, they quiet guys, isn't it lovely working from home? Well, that advantage shrunk, and Moky the Elder recognized that at his retirement speech to the quiet please, to the German legislature. He said, you know, war's been very good for Germany, but other countries are catching up in our staff procedures, and our victories will not be as cheap in the future. So we may want to think about other ways of getting what we want to do, you know, influencing foreign affairs. Well, a good indication of that is that the Germans wargamed out their peace offensive ahead of time. We know that because Hans Delbruck, the gentleman who was talking about civilians studying war, he wrote while the war was still going on that the German staff should have included people from the foreign ministry in the war game because they would have told them that the Allies were used to just small movements of front. Even though the war game showed that you wouldn't get to anything strategic, it would still scare the Allies, and we would get much better terms then than later. Well, we also know that the British conducted a war game looking at different things that the Germans could do with the forces freed up from Russia, and they picked for the war game where the first peace offensive took place. They brought in the faculty from their war college because apparently they did not have people at the Corps or other levels that could do wargaming, and we'll talk more about that. They wargamed it out, and the depth of penetration from the British war game was about the same as the German war game. And then when the Germans actually executed, they got about the same depth. So, you know, one of the things that everybody says that's a wargame professional is that war games don't predict the future. They don't tell you what will happen. And we've all been scarred by the contractors who say, my war game proves you should buy my widget. Still, here's a case where two different nations simultaneously use essentially the same techniques of wargaming, and both of them come up with roughly the same answer as what happens when you execute. In science, that would be like other people conducting the same experiment and coming up with the same answer, something of a validation. Anyway, getting back to individuals and trying not to advance too fast. Technology is a wonderful thing. Here we go. I went too far. Okay, the next individual with just a huge impact is General Seek. Sect, I guess is how you pronounce it. Everybody knows about General Manstein, General Rommel, and Guderian, and all these folks. But the person who set the foundation for all that was General Seek. He was the Treaty of Versailles outlawed a general staff. So they set up a troop office, which was the general staff. And he was the chief of the non-general staff for a few years. And then he was the commander of the army. And the Treaty of Versailles said the German army had to get much smaller than it was. So, and limited the number of officers you could have. So Seek had to make the decision as to which people to keep. And he didn't keep the people with frontline combat experience. And he didn't keep the bonds. He didn't keep the noble officers, not many of them. The people he kept were the general staff officers, the wargamers. And because the Army was so much smaller, a lot of these general staff officers that were generals and colonels during the First World War wound up being captains and majors in the peacetime Army. And they not only kept their wargaming capabilities, they actually designed new wargames to be played at lower echelons. So much further down in the Russian Army, you started the German Army, you had wargaming going on, and then the general also set up this method where he taught the Army how to learn. Okay, anytime now. We'll get to the next slide someday. You saw it briefly. There we go. So the first thing that he did was make sure that they were very honest and very thorough in their examination of military history. The German Army told the civilians, oh, the sun was in our eyes, we were stabbed in the back. Their internal histories were very frank. Here's how we screwed up. And they would get what they could from other nations too. Then there was a tradition and also a lot of encouragement for officers to come up with theories as to how war games should be executed. And then German doctrine in the interwar period, almost through the entire interwar period, their doctrine was always labeled draft. And it was revised frequently. And then they had war games, even in the lean years, where they did a lot of wargaming, and they would put the doctrine into those plans. Well, that's pretty much the cycle for all innovation. During the First World War, the British, when they were coming up with how to do armored warfare, they would look at the history of what had gone on before, came up with a theory how to use tanks, the draft doctrine. They would plan an attack. They would actually execute the attack. That would be a little bit more of history that would help them refine their theory, which would refine the doctrine, that would refine their plans, and then they would execute again. So every time the Brits executed, they got a little bit better at better armor, better tactics, more effective operational use of armor. Well, there's two problems with the traditional cycle of innovation. One is that as you're getting better and better, your adversary is seeing you getting better and better, and they're coming up with counters as you're coming up with ways to be more effective. The other problem is you need to execute. You need to actually see how well this stuff works in war so you know what changes to make. Well, what SYSCON did was to go through this cycle as I described, but only instead of actual execution, you now had a war game. And that war game was used as kind of a synthetic history that allowed this cycle to continue. Now, this was done by the German Army. They kept refining what they called mobile operations, which the world would call blitzkrieg. The German Navy is probably even more in this area, where they were behind the British technologically at the beginning of World War II, but during the entire interwar period, they had wargamed against British doctrine year after year after year, and gradually developed their tactics and doctrine. Even when they didn't have any submarines, they continued to wargame, both on paper and live. They would have PT boats with flags that would raise for when they were supposed to be submerged, you know, kind of playing the parts of submarines before they had submarines. And so this had a huge impact. If you've studied the fall of France, France had, the Western Allies had more troops in theater than the Germans. They had more divisions in the theater than the Germans. They had more planes and way more artillery and way more heavy artillery. The only category that the Germans had more of was anti-aircraft guns. And yet the Germans won fast, and the big impact was this whole system of becoming smarter and smarter, and was set in place by the General SYSCON a decade before World War II started. And we are trying to change slides once again. Okay, there we go. Now we get into the interwar wargaming, and one area of interwar wargaming is strategic innovation. The first Paul Mill wargaming, really the first what I'd call a third generation wargame, where you not only have military forces, but you have all the elements of national power. The war games were held at the Ministry of Defense. They would bring in people from the War Department, from the Naval Department. They would bring in the Krupps to say how long would it take you to gin up production, reporters. They would have, and this is the first I've seen of a red team trying to replicate foreign tactics and doctrine. They would bring back their attachés, like they would contact their attaché in Paris and say, you know, Hans, I know you've had to be putting up with this terrible French food and this dreadful French wine for months and months now. We're going to bring you back to Berlin, and in our war game, we want you to fight the French forces. And obviously, you're going to try to win, but try to use the French doctrine and try to fight the way that the French would fight this. Fortunately for the rest of the world, when Hitler came to power, he ordered these war games stopped. And he said, from now on, the decisions on the fate of Germany will be made by me with blood and mud. And as I said, I gave this talk twice to the German War College. And in both cases, I said, you know, that sounds really stupid. Does it sound as stupid in German? And they're like, yeah, it sounds as stupid in German. Unfortunately, Hitler did not stop the operational wargaming. Okay, next slide. Anytime now. There we go. Okay, now we go to the United States, and we have, and again, I try to emphasize individual people, but a lot of this is organizations. So during the interwar period, the United States Navy War College basically came up with a way to learn how to learn. They would do war games on paper. They would do fleet exercise. The two would feed each other. They would have these experiments and prototypes to try to figure out what the numbers should be in the war games. And they had cycles of war games where the war games would feed the exercise would feed the war games, and then 1 year's war game would influence the next. And over the interwar period, they kept losing to the Japanese, but trying different ideas, eliminating what didn't work, and identifying requirements. Early in the period, they would just all run to Japan and bring the Japanese fleet to battle. Well, fairly early on, they figured out we don't have the gas to get from San Diego to Tokyo. We're going to be worn out and not working as well as we need to be by that point. We're going to need places to refit and refuel and rearm, like maybe the islands we just gave to Japan after World War I. I guess we're going to need to take them back. So we'd have to figure out a way for the Marines to do amphibious operations. We're going to need to do underway replenishment. So a lot of these things that would take years to figure out, not alone procure, was anticipated years before the war that gave the lead time to do these things. Today, it's hard to believe that the Marines hadn't always done amphibious attack. In the interwar period, when it became obvious they were going to need to, they turned to wargaming and analysis of history and theory and doctrine and a lot to come to that. There's a faint, and it is more than just the war games. You need the technology to implement it, but the war games can help you know what technology to look for. There's a great quote I read. They were talking about when the Marines first encountered the Higgin boats, those shallow boats that were used around New Orleans in the oil industry before World War II. Marine Corps officers saw the Higgins boat and said, that's it. That's what we're looking for. Well, the war game showed them what to look for. In the Army, because of budget cuts during the 20s and the Great Depression in the 30s, Army ground forces weren't doing a lot of wargaming, and the wargaming they were doing was mainly for training. It was really just the Air Corps that really did some fascinating things in wargaming, and it was. I'll even abbreviate this a little bit for time for Q&A. But there was one faculty member at the Air Corps tactics school down at Montgomery who ran a war game, and from like 29 to 32, and this young captain invented the war game, taught the class, designed it himself. It was an air, sea, land war game with logistics and infrastructure construction and drone operations. And it was kind of curious because the students said it's too hard, it's too cumbersome, you know, but yet in the end of year evaluation, more people picked that as the most valuable course than any other course. Well, when this captain left, no other faculty member was willing to take the monster over. So it basically fell out of the curriculum. And I remember thinking at the time when I first heard about this, well, that's too bad. How much of an impact can that have? But I'm going to write this book someday. I should at least mention this captain's name. And I asked the guy who had done the research about it, and he was desperately trying not to grin. He says, "Oh, I'm sure you've never heard of him. He was a captain by the name of George Kenny." Well, very few people had ever heard of George Kenny, or Captain Kenny, or would recognize a picture of him. But if we could get to the next slide, you would see that several years later, a great many people got to know the way that Lieutenant General George Kenny looked. Kenny was MacArthur's air boss, and he commanded U.S. Army aircraft, naval aircraft, Australian aircraft, and some historians really attribute the whole strategy of island hopping to Kenny. So what impact did those war games have? Okay, then in the case of France, you have kind of a false dichotomy, and we'll get to this later, where the French felt that their armed forces were mainly reservist. They needed their war games to teach doctrine and teach tactics and train these guys up during the small amount of time they had them each year. And that they shouldn't use war games to try to develop innovation like the Germans were. And there was at least one case where they did use a war game to look at a potential German threat, where in their war game, the Germans attacked through the Ardennes to get across the Meuse behind the bulk of the French army. Well, in that case, the French playing red followed French doctrine. And so when the guys playing the Germans got to the Meuse River, they waited for several days for their artillery to come up. And during those several days, the French were able to bring up reserves. And they didn't, the red side, the German side, was still able to get across the river, but the bridgehead was maintained. But the French felt that was sufficiently worrisome for them to make some fairly modest increases to the defense of that area. Well, when the real Germans invaded, they didn't wait days for their artillery to come up. They basically designated today the Luftwaffe will provide close air support to the troops getting across the Meuse, and the breakthrough changed the course of that campaign and really of world history. And by the light of the silvery moon, I want to do, there we go. Okay, so most of this, you'll have to read the book. Just a quick comment on Manstein. Manstein was one of the people who helped set up the Paul Mill wargaming in the Ministry of Defense during the interwar period. His name as a Captain Manstein appears on the cover of a report on a war game. He also used wargaming to make the case that the Germans should attack through the Ardennes instead of doing the Schlieffen Plan right. And so here, just that one individual had a huge impact, and basically his war games helped convince the people above him in the chain of command that that this was the right way to proceed. Okay, anytime now. I'm sure glad I cut this back to give lots of time for questions. Okay, in the case of the British, you had both extremes in wargaming. You had Sir Henry Tizard, and he kind of invented the whole field of operations research. So those of you who are OR guys, or maybe reinvented, but that's a story for another time, or a question if we have time. And so very, very math intensive, very, very sophisticated kind of stuff. The other extreme was Montgomery, who had wargaming to a degree of informality that I don't think has been seen before or since. Before all of his major operations, from Goodwood to Al-Alamein to everything else, before the fight, he would turn to his officer and say, "Okay, what are we doing day one?" And okay, I think this would get us that far. Okay, the intel guy, what would the Germans be doing while we're doing this? Okay, given what the Germans are doing, given what you're doing, I think we'd get the front lines to here. Okay, R4, our loggy, do we still have beans? Do we still have bullets? Okay, ops, what are you going to do day two? No dice, no sophisticated analysis or adjudication team, literally walking through it, but a red side and a blue side and adjudication and looking at how everything would turn out. And you know, we Americans saw the movie Patton, are supposed to not like Montgomery, but he was fairly successful at Al-Alamein, where other people hadn't been. Okay, and there's less time for questions. There we go. Now, in addition to that, we also have an area of wargaming in the United Kingdom where you used war games to teach and then to learn what to teach. And this kind of shows how the US Army focusing on teaching, the French Army focusing on teaching, it didn't have to be either or. That's the Western Approaches Command. Commander Galbert Roberts was put in charge, later made captain, and the effort started out as purely educational. You would have these young women who would, as part of the course for both the convoy merchant ship captains and the captains of the escort, they would go through the class together and they would do the end of class exercise together. And this war game, well, they would be timed between classes. And the women were there and there was no class going on. And I don't know why this hasn't been made into a Hollywood movie yet, or at least, you know, some great British epic, because it's got all the things that Hollywood loves. Some of these women became engaged to some of the captains. Some of the, you know, they were sea battles where their fiance was under attack. You know, it just, we get Tom Cruise. But anyway, and so they would be coming up with different tactics that would then be passed by the actual captains. They would look at it, see what they agreed with, look at how the war games were done. Things would get incorporated into the next course. In fact, towards the end of the war, they're working out new tactics while a fight is going on in the middle of the Atlantic. And the Germans had introduced a new weapon, and they were looking at different things that could be done to counter that weapon while the fight was going on. So very, very sophisticated and huge impact. And the next slide should be coming up any moment now. Okay, now a lot of this will be in the book, but ground forces, while the Germans taught people how to do war games, we tended to teach wargaming. So I've only found one case where where an Army did wargaming, First Army Hodges, and they had a former faculty member from Command and General Staff College. Army Air Forces didn't do any wargaming at all. Remember, it ended in 32. The Marines did wargaming, and in some cases, it was eerily close to what the actual outcome would be. And then the next invasion, it was not close at all. And the reason for that was the Japanese changed their doctrine. And that, so again, playing red correctly, again, comes up as being critical. Now, the Navy was also very successful, not only before the war, but by some sea stories during the war. In fact, it was so successful that Admiral Nimitz, who was just God in the Navy, after the war wrote this letter about how valuable wargaming was. And I remember thinking, as a kid, as a teenager, why did he pick this time to write the letter? Well, the reason he wrote the letter, I think, was that wargaming had really gone into an eclipse at the Naval War College and elsewhere, for a lot of reasons. One, there was a decline in the study of war in the war colleges. You had the rise of the efficient DoD, where a lot of the instruction was financial management and stuff like that. Even Korea was seen as an aberration. But yet wargaming came back. And one was the onset of the Cold War, then the assumed credibility of computers, the prestige of operations research, and a lot of the rebirth of wargaming came from RAND and operations research folks. And then a reaction against the management mindset of Vietnam. But the biggest reason of all was that it slowly started to dawn on people that the obsolescence of war supposedly brought about by the atomic bomb had been greatly exaggerated. Now, as you look at these reasons, one that isn't up there is that we got back into wargaming because we were behind the Soviets. We were, but we didn't know about it until years and years later after we had caught up. It's almost as if Sputnik could somehow be kept secret and we were behind in the space race, but didn't find out about it until after we caught up. Now, this will go a little bit quicker. It needs to. And one of the reasons is that after World War II, a lot of what goes on in war games are different organizations. So you read a lot about what RAND did. Also, since World War II, a surprising amount of stuff is still classified. Third generation, all elements of national power wargaming has been done in the basement of the Pentagon, an organization called SAG-D, since the Eisenhower administration. And almost none of their stuff has been declassified. However, there are some individuals whose contributions were great enough that they have become known. And their slides will even come up at some point. And there we go. Oh, that's really ahead. Okay, back up, yeah. So the first is Dr. Thomas Schelling, a very early RAND wargamer, one of the nuclear theorists, one of the fathers of Palmil wargaming, third generation, I call third generation wargames, one of the founders of the modern Kennedy School of Government, and in 2005, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. We were very fortunate to have him as a keynote speaker at Connections a few years ago. Brilliant individual, and made contributions in so many areas, including a big proponent of wargaming. Then, if we go to the next gentleman, oh my God, Colonel Macedonia, he brought wargaming back to the Army War College. One of the first people within the American military to reach out to the commercial wargaming community, came up with a lot of tools that stayed there, even after his tenure, and he had quite a bit of recognition. He and it's bittersweet. He tells the story about how a bunch of his boss and his boss's boss shows up when the general list was coming out, he was a ROTC graduate. He was not from a long military family. He hadn't had the Hollywood assignments early in his career, so he wasn't even really paying attention to the selection. And they come in and, you know, congratulations, you're on the list. And as a general to be, he's, you know, when is he going to go to charm school? And they send him over to the hospital for a double plus good physical, because now as a general officer, they're going to really track his health and make sure he stays healthy. And they find out he has terminal cancer. And so rather than making brigadier, he gets medically retired in days so he can have at least a little bit of time with his family. Well, the treatment was more effective than anyone thought it would be. And he did finally succumb to the cancer, but it was years and years later. So, but talk about a roller coaster. Then the next person that I want to talk about when he comes up is, Moody Suter. Moody Suter was a character. And the bottom line for Moody Suter is, what does it take to make general officer? As a captain, he was one of the co-founders of the aggressor batteries. During the end of this Vietnam War, the Navy came up with Top Gun, and they showed that dissimilar combat training could be very effective. Well, the Air Force wanted part of that, and Moody Suter was one of 3 people that helped make that happen. As a major, he talked the commander, the 4-star commander of TAC, out of enough money to start a little thing called Red Flag. As a lieutenant colonel in the Pentagon, he stands up the Checkmate office. And Checkmate, the shorthand version, and I know this is a simplification, they're basically the strategy cell for Headquarters Air Force. And he sets this up as a lieutenant colonel. Well, there's a joke in town that at the Pentagon, lieutenant colonels are such big shots, their cubicle gets a visitor's chair. And here he sets up a high-profile major organization within the Air Staff. And then as a colonel, he sets up the Warrior Preparation Center in Germany. And that was really the first of the theater wargaming centers. We now have one in Korea, one in one in Hawaii, one down in Tampa. The Warrior Preparation Center was first. And he did not make general officer, which means, like all of us, when you come up on 30 years, you have to retire. Well, he came up on his mandatory retirement date 6 weeks before the Warrior Preparation Center was activated. And so he didn't get to have his picture on the wall as the first commander of the Warrior Preparation Center. However, and unfortunately, it wasn't until after he died, but the building's named after him now. So there is that. The building is also named after him at Checkmate. So a person just enormous impact. Then the next one is a civilian, but a civilian who works for the United States Navy. And that is Bud Hay. And I don't have Bud Hay's picture either, but he worked at the Naval War College Wargaming Department, one of their lead wargame designers. He came up with Global, the first Title X wargame. And this was at the time when there was a great deal of interest in the fight in the Fulda Gap in Germany. It was a natural invasion corridor. And so the Army would wargame this out over and over and over again, and what would be needed to help us hold the line at the Fulda Gap. And basically the Navy said, you know, if we'd ever do go to war with Russia, it's not going to be along a thin strip of land in Germany. It's really going to be a global conflict. And the Navy can influence that conflict on a global basis. And it's also not going to be a few days or a few weeks of this initial invasion. It's going to take longer. So the global war game was started in '79, from like 80 to 85, and then 85 to 90. They war gamed out over 2 weeks, a few weeks of a war, and then the next summer they took up where they left off the year before and went a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. So they saw basically that the Soviet Union couldn't win, that they could not capture enough gross national product to equal the amount of gross national product that was unconquered, and that it would only be a matter of time before we buried them in stuff. And this was enormously influential. You had a lot of congressional staffers, you had a lot of members of Congress. I want to leave some time for questions, but they had a particularly good person, or a particularly effective person, playing the President of the United States, if anybody wants to ask about that. Okay, trying to move forward. I know I should try to move to the next screen during the last of the anecdotes or something. We are getting close. There will be some time. Okay, so the next champion is Mark Herman. And Mark Herman is, again, an interesting fellow. He could have been a stunt double for one of the Doctor Who's, but he started out as a teenager at the Strategy and Tactics Wargame publishing and design company in New York City. He went on to be the CEO of a wargame publisher and design company himself, Victory Games. He worked as a defense contractor in DC for many years, retiring as a senior partner at Booz Allen Hamilton. And his greatest claim to fame is that in the late 1980s, he designed a game called Gulf Strike that had 26, 28 scenarios. And one of those scenarios was a hypothetical invasion of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia by Saddam Hussein. So on the morning when Saddam Hussein actually invaded Kuwait, Mark gets a phone call. He's in the Pentagon by 10. He's under contract by 12. By 2 that afternoon, they've done all the checks with intelligence and made sure that the order of battle was reflecting what was actually going on. By sometime before midnight, they concluded there was no combination of steps that Saddam could take to be successful. At some point around then, Mark was also told he wasn't going to leave the building with a copy of his war game. The modifications they had made during the course of their execution were such that it was now classified and staying where it was. So again, an individual with a lot of influence, both commercially and in the military wargaming. Okay, and speaking of commercial wargaming, we talked about how people like Tom Janes and H.G. Wells did some things that were moving towards more simulation wargaming. There were other Brits in the interwar period in the 1950s that were doing miniatures type wargaming and closer to modern. The first unambiguous second generation wargame for a civilian market was by Charles Roberts in the 1950s. And I'd use the analogy, some people believe the Altair was the first personal computer, but you kind of needed to be a geek and, you know, it was a kit and you had to set all the switches. The Apple II looks like a personal computer, or the Apple. There were other people that did things that could be considered, but what Charles Roberts came up with was a complete game in a box. The map you needed, the counters you needed, the rules you needed, everything else was in one box. And so if you wanted to play a war game on the Battle of the Bulge, you bought the war game Battle of the Bulge and you could proceed. Then in the 1960s, Roberts' company goes bankrupt. And so the creditor, the printer, Eric Dott, instead of liquidating the company, and he could have done that, decides to take it over and continues the Avalon Hill Game Company, which is the principal company during the 60s. When the 70s comes along, a gentleman by the name of Jim Dunnigan buys a very small circulation magazine called Strategy and Tactics. And he decides that by putting a war game in a magazine and having the magazine come out many times a year, you can generate a whole lot more war games. And he not only did that, but he included articles on wargame design. And kind of ironically, he helped launch a lot of his competitors. And then when we get into the 1980s, people like Chris Crawford and Gary Grigsby start coming up with computerized war games. And at this point, the people that owned computers tended to be overpaid male geeks who were interested in military history. So we forget, but a lot of the early recreational software, a fairly big percentage, was war games. So war games helped the recreational wargaming market kind of get going. By the 1990s, it was a $25 billion industry. By the early 2000s, the recreational software, which is a lot beyond war games, actually bypassed Hollywood. And depending on how you do the math, it's like 2002 or 2004, 2005. Now, what all this translates to is that more and more citizens were playing war games. In the 50s, it was thousands. By the 60s, it was tens of thousands. By the 70s, with the magazines being so much cheaper, it was hundreds of thousands. By the 80s, it was millions, even with how much computers cost. As computers got cheaper, it was tens of millions. And today, you literally have billions of people playing computer games all around the world. Okay, now, home stretch. Instead of MVPs of wargaming, we now turn to the real champions of wargame. And one of the great champions of wargames was a guy by the name of Andrew Marshall. He was the Office of Office of Secretary of Defense, Office of Net Assessment boss from 1973 to 2015. Do the math, that's a lot of continuity. He was really an all methods of analysis guy. He was both an advocate and a critic of wargaming. He reached out to the wargaming community and James Dunnigan to try to come up with ways to make wargaming more effective for his purposes, and actually did wargames to help develop wargaming. Again, not everything he did can be talked about. Then another champion of wargaming, and the real other champion is Robert Work. I'll start talking about him before his slide comes up, but he was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense came out with a memo that said we needed to do more innovation, and one of the four main points were wargaming. Then he came out with two memos specifically saying that wargaming had atrophied in the American military, needed to be reinvigorated. He chaired two four-star summits. He directed the creation of a repository of information on war games. So for the first time, DoD wargame designers could do a literature search to see if somebody had already done a wargame on this topic that we could learn from. And let's keep going to the next slide someday. Okay, come on, I don't want to say this one before it comes up. All right, that's fascinating. There we go. And then Wargames Top Banana. Dr. Peter Perla, he wrote the book, The Art of Wargaming. He wrote it in 1989, came out in 90. So my book has 30 years more of the history of wargaming. His book is still the best of how analysis and wargaming needs to work together. He led the Center for Naval Analysis wargaming efforts for decades. The real guiding light of the integration of wargaming and analysis and a lot of theoretical work. He's quoted so much in so many places by so many people, and every time you see a list of books on wargaming, you know, his is always on it. Absolutely key person. The Top Banana is a little bit of an inside joke. Connections decided to come up with a Lifetime Achievement Award, but the trophy we were going to give him was supposed to show up, was going to be there for the presentation, didn't get delivered when it was promised. We were about to go on stage. I was looking around for something that was kind of the size of a trophy to be a stand-in until it showed up. On the snack table, there was a banana. So I grabbed the banana, and the whole presentation thing, shaking hands and turning over with a banana. People lost their hearing from all the laughter and applause and everything else. But truly, truly the giant in the field of wargaming. So from that, let us move towards the conclusion before the 2 hours is up. If we could move to the next slide. So how about tomorrow's most valuable players in war games? One way to do that is to get to know your colleagues in the field. And a great way to do that is to go to a connections conference. If you live in the US, we have Connections US that brings together, started in 1993 was the first one. It brings together professional and commercial wargamers, people in wargaming education, so they can learn from each other. Connections UK was the first overseas Connections. That was followed by Connections Oz, Connections Netherlands, Connections North. And just this year, before COVID broke out, we had Connections France, which is interesting. It's both a Connections and a serious game conference held concurrently with speakers in both areas in a deliberate strategy to try to have the more broad application of gaming and wargaming kind of learn from each other. And then this year, we're going to have Connections US, Connections Global taking place from the 10th through the 14th of August. With COVID, we can't have an in-person convention, and we decided since we can't get together, we're going to be online, people can log in from anywhere. So it's being very deliberately designed and executed as a global event. We've set hours so that it's convenient for people in UK and Europe to participate. We're trying to recruit not only people, but content from a lot of different countries. In fact, another person that I could have very easily included in the champions of wargaming, Professor Phil Sabin, the founder, one of the 4 founders of Connections UK, and the teacher of wargaming at King's College London for many years. He's now retired and living in South America. He's going to be one of our guest speakers, our keynote speakers from his home. So it's a good way to stay in touch and to get smarter on this. So if we can get to the next slide before we run out of time. Again, if you want to learn more, here's my book. Here's Dr. Perla's book. And so in the time remaining, questions, comments, discussions, material for the second edition of my book on items of the history of wargaming that I may have left out. And if you want to contact me, that's my civilian email down at the bottom. So in the time remaining, Sebastian, why don't you do some triage and ask what the questions that would be most valuable.
So Matt, thank you first for your wonderful presentation. I learned a lot personally about some of the MVPs about wargaming history that I didn't know about. I have a couple questions, both that were emailed to me prior to your lecture because some people couldn't attend, and I have some from the chat. First is from T.S. Ellen, and he is more of a comment than a question. He says, if you're ever at West Point, many of Patton's books ended up in the library with all his notations. So if you're ever up at West Point, try to check those out of the library.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, one of the quick things I left out, I'll do quick. One of the things that the author discovered in doing his research is that from the age of 16 on, Patton read as many books as is assigned to students going through a year of the war college every year. So he put himself through war college every year of his career while still doing his normal job. And when he was commanding 3rd Army and sleeping a different place every 4th night, the number of books he read dropped to 70% of his peacetime reading rate.
The next question is, what is the one thing that tends to have the biggest impact on the value of wargaming?
Okay. Probably the biggest thing is that it needs to be read to really listened to and integrated with decision making and other methods. All of us who have been in the field for any period of time are very wary of people who say war games predict this, or especially war game proves that. War game doesn't prove anything, but I try to treat it like an intelligence indicator. An intelligence officer never says the enemy's going to do X. They say enemy has I have high confidence in this report, medium confidence, low confidence. And so as we look at war game results, we should neither take them as sacred or proof, but we should also not ignore them. So finding the right size grain of salt to treat war game outcomes, I think is probably the most valuable thing that needs to be done.
So the next question is quite interesting. It says, do you have any history or insights on how wargaming developed in non-Western powers like Japan, or is wargaming mostly a Western concept?
Oh, no, not at all. Chess arose in India, Go, what we call Go, and I almost included this in the briefing. Some scholars say it was invented by Sun Tzu, and Sun Tzu's emphasis on anticipation and thinking ahead is very much what's conveyed by the Go. Japan stole their ground wargaming from the Prussians and their naval wargaming from the British. China, I'll be fast, fascinating case. Modern China originally got their wargaming techniques from the Soviet Union. Then Mao shut down the staff colleges for a generation. And and by the way, the Chinese wargame their intervention in Korea, and the wargame predicted they would, not predicted, gave insights that indicated they might lose, and they decided to pursue a different course of action. So when we had our rapprochement with the Chinese, one of the first things they did was try to learn all they could about American wargaming. And they sent fairly high-level two-star delegations over to the United States to learn all they could about American wargaming. After Tiananmen Square, we defined wargames as munitions and didn't allow them to buy any more of our wargames, our defense contractor wargames or military wargames. So they started buying our commercial wargames. So China was using wargames that were more user-friendly, faster to execute than ours. Then around 1999, 2000, the Chinese decided that their wargaming was much too fragmented, that this corps was still using Soviet method of wargaming. It had been passed on from one generation to another. This corps was using a US commercial off-the-shelf wargame. This corps didn't use wargames at all. So they created an institute for wargaming, 600 people, 300 military, 300 civilian, commanded at first by a brigadier general. He retired as a two-star, big budget, pretty big budget, like $60, $80 million a year. And these guys came up with war games that they programmed inside China that would standardize war games at different echelons. And they created war games from the very low tactical level all the way up to the strategic level. In fact, they did a war game that started in the current year and went out 40 years. Their political leader said that wasn't going out far enough, so they redid the game going out 70 years, and then they were told, 70 years, it's too fuzzy, that's going out too far. From now on, every number of years, do this game again, but only go out 50 years.
So actually, there is an interesting paper that I wanted to mention by Nicholas Schilling, I think out of Europe. That his paper is called "Playing Soldiers: A Wargame in the Late Qing and Republican China." It's, I think, available through Brill University. Matt, I'll send it to you. I have a copy. If anyone else is interested, I'll also upload it to the Goose Drive later. And Dean Chang out of Heritage did a fantastic presentation on Chinese wargaming last year at Connections. if you're ever interested. I think he wrote a War on the Rocks article a couple of years ago about it as well. The next question is, Prussian and French and American military advisors who were active in Japan prior to World War II, did they do any wargaming? It would have been interesting to know if Japanese officers thought of it or they borrowed it.
Well, the Japanese had already been wargaming for 60, 70 years by then. After Russia was defeated in the Russo-Japanese War, their diet did a study. And I saw this in an article, but I've had friends, I think Stephen Downs Martin was going to be on, he's searching, people over in England are searching, and I saw the article, but the diet came up with like 16 findings or 20 findings or something like that. One of the findings was the Japanese wargamed more effectively, and we Russians didn't. So Russia needed to put more effort into wargaming. So as early as the Russia-Japanese War, the Japanese were wargaming. They were also wargaming on the naval side up to that point. So our attaches or our students didn't, that I know of, learn from the Japanese. We did have a student who went through the German War College. I think his name was Niedermeyer. I'd have to check. I think that's what it was. And he saw the German methods of wargaming and how they depicted what the Germans called mobile operations, and decided the United States was in trouble. And if we got into a war, the war on the Allied side, we would need to significantly change how we fought, and came back to the United States. So that was a case where probably wasn't the best idea for the Germans to invite one of our guys to go through their curriculum.
So the next question is is by Maurice Suckling. He says, Donald Featherstone mentions the use of cards in war games in his book Solo Wargaming in 1973. Is there any record of cards being used in war games prior to this? Featherstone mentions the use of regimental cards, tactic cards, chance events like weather, couriers, intercepted, and more. No,
in fact, I didn't know that Featherstone had that in 73, you think you said? That's news to me. And one of the reasons I do this, I mean, I never get paid for this. I do this at Connections and Origins and elsewhere. I'm still finding out new things about wargaming. It was not that long ago that I found out about the Chinese war game for their intervention in Korea. Quite recently, I found out about the real problem with the Japanese war game before Midway. So I'm absolutely certain there are several people listening to this talk that know an element about the history of wargaming that I don't. And I am going to do a second edition of the book, so I would be very grateful for any tips that I don't that can lead me to new information. And if I already know it, no harm, you know. Anyway, go ahead.
Another question was, what happened to Chris Crawford? That was a big general question.
I don't know. Next question.
Next question is from one of the ones that were mailed in prior to the event. Was what are some of the wargaming resources that you recommend for young wargamers starting out that want to get smart on wargaming?
Very good. Obviously, Peter Perlo's book, and in great humility, I think my book is fairly helpful. And then I think the other thing is to a spectrum of war games. I was fortunate enough to hear oh shoot, my mind does this to me. Chuck Yeager talk right after the movie The Right Stuff came out, when he was at the height of his fame, and they were asked why he was such a good pilot, and he started to have a smart answer, but then he said, well, no, wait a minute, you deserve a straight answer. I was able to live at times when other people didn't, because I was a test pilot at the time, right after World War II, where we brought in a lot of Japanese aircraft, a lot of German aircraft, some Italian aircraft, and we were looking at what we could learn from these aircraft. And so I flew a great many different types of aircraft, and I learned that different aircraft would give you little tells when they're about to stall or have something go wrong. And later, when I was flying out at Edwards and these new experimental aircraft, I would recognize some of these different characteristics, and it was just such a great advantage to me. And Jim Dunnigan talks about, the key to wargame design is plagiarism. The more different war games you play, with a card system, with hub and spoke, with hexes, with areas, different subjects, different time periods, the larger your bag of tricks become. Oh, and I guess the other thing is that wargaming is, particularly wargame design, and even being in a shop that applies wargaming, is a lot more like architecture than most other fields. If you're a mathematician, you really only need to know math. But if you're an architect, you need to both be an artist, so what you come up with is pretty, and you do need to be part engineer to make sure what you come up with doesn't fall down. And so very few people, I'm not sure I know of any, who succeed in wargame, know only wargaming. They're wargaming and their operations research. Or in my case, I started out with wargaming and airbase engineering. My first wargames professionally was to teach my prime beef team how to better recover the base after the Soviets tried to blow it to flinders. And that led to something else, which led to something else, which led to something else. So you need to really have wargaming and a complementary area of study, I believe, to be effective in wargaming.
So another interesting question was, if you could go back in wargaming history and change event or occurrence, what would it have been?
Oh God, boy, that's a great question. One would be, we attacked Pearl Harbor at dawn on a Sunday, and we hit pretty much the same targets the Japanese did. And the action report on that war game read a lot like the congressional committee that investigated after World War II ended. The ammunition was stored too far away from the guns, a lot of things that slowed down our response, especially to the first wave. And I will always wonder, and these war games were played like 34, 36, something like that, the exact years in the book. But not just months before Pearl Harbor, but years before. And the ammunition was still stored far away from the guns. So again, war games don't predict the future. They don't prove things. They aren't a crystal ball. But it sure would have been nice if they paid more attention to the reports of those war games and changed a few things at Pearl Harbor.
The next question is sort of talking about how you started Connections, and if you can sort of give the brief history of how Connections came about.
Okay, thank you. I did not plant that question, but I should have. For those who've heard this before, our origin story is great. I was the research assistant for wargaming at a school called the School for Advanced Airpower Studies. It's now the School for Advanced Air and Space Power Studies. But and so we would take students that had finished intermediate service school and keep them for a whole nother year. And these guys were going to be the strategists for the Air Force. And very early in the school's existence. And Colonel Warden, who was the guy who came up with the Instant Thunder Plan in the basement of the Pentagon, which is the basis for what became the Desert Storm Plan. So something of a living legend, is the commander of the Squadron Officer School, Air Command and Staff College, which at that time SAS came under. And I had been in 2 of his briefings, but I'd never been introduced to him. I was just a face in the audience. For all I knew, he didn't know me from Adam. Well, it's the eve of Christmas Eve, and some people are starting to leave early, and I'm sitting there figuring out, how early can I duck out, and what other tasks should I really do before I leave for the holidays. And the phone rings, and it's the Colonel Warden. And he starts asking me all these questions about war games. And he's quite concerned. And real quick, they war gamed the Instant Thunder plan, and it only showed attrition. So he would like take out the Power 2 radars. And not only would in the war game, you take out the power and the radar still work, but the guns or the missiles that should be cued by the radar is still cued when you take out the radar. So you didn't have these secondary effects other than attrition. And then he comes to Command and Staff College, and he's supposed to teach about effects, and our war games don't do the effects, and they're so cumbersome to learn. We spend so much time teaching people how to play the war game. We don't teach as much time on war. So he's asking me, how can we make this better? And does anybody do it right? And I say, well, these guys are doing this right, and these guys are doing that right, but nobody's doing everything right. He says, well, what can we do about that? And I said, well, we could have a conference where we bring everybody together and they can exchange best practices. And he said, okay, do it. And then he asked me another question. And I'm back in my mind, I'm like warning Will Rogers, did I just get told to put on a conference? But he just snap, one question after another. And finally, it's after 3 o'clock, and he finally says, well, I'm a couple minutes late for another meeting. This has been very helpful. Thank you very much. Have a Merry Christmas. And he hangs up. And I'm like, was I asked to put on a conference? And I look around, and I'm the last person in the office. And I'm like, that was a good afternoon. And I'm like, I can't ask the Colonel Warden if he asked me to put on a conference. I could ask my boss, but then it would be like I'm asking to be asked. So I have this bad habit I'm trying to get better at. When I don't know the answer, when I don't know what to do, I don't do it. And so I go home for Christmas, I come back in the new year, and I'm walking down the hallway of Air Command and Staff College, and Colonel Warden's come down the hall the other way, and his whole face lights up. And he goes, hey, Matt, how's the conference coming? And I'm like, well, I've been giving a lot of thought, sir. And I said, oh, okay, well, I have a few minutes now. You want to go back to my office? No, sir, please. Let me get on your calendar. I'd much rather do it that way and have everything prepared when I come see you. He says, okay, but, let's do it soon. And so I'm like, okay, I guess I'm putting on a conference. And just several months later, through a lot of help from Colonel Warden, because he knew people in Hollywood and he knew people out of other places, we had the very first Connections Conference and at Maxwell Air Force Base down in Montgomery, Alabama. And just about every prominent designer from the commercial side was there, and people from, I think every service, or at least two or three, say 3 services were there. And it's been held every year since 1993. And by going online, it's going to be held again this year.
So I guess one of the other questions I wanted to ask was, where do you see wargaming going forward? I know you focus a lot on history and where wargaming came from, but in drawing lessons from history, what do you see the projection for wargaming is?
Very good. Well, I think there's 2 progressions, one technical and one kind of procedural. I think wargaming has been evolving from fire and movement to being more comprehensive. That war games had focused, the early war games, simulation war games, have focused on winning battles. And then they started to get better and better at looking at campaign length periods of time. The Chinese are probably leaders in the world as far as looking deep into the future. And we do some very good work through SAGD and elsewhere, but it tends to be early in a crisis or looking at crisis, not necessarily long-term stuff. Procedurally, we are starting to look at how to set a theater over years so we're in a better position if conflict occurs, and what can we do to try to prevent conflict. So I think procedurally we're moving towards more all of government wargaming and maybe peace gaming, where you're using the techniques of war games to try to come up with a solution that not only helps you, that right now it's win-lose. We're trying to come up with a way that wargame helps us win and helps our adversary lose. It may be that in the time, wargaming will come up, we'll have an option of coming up with a solution that's win-win, so that our current adversaries don't want to beat us because they're better off. So I think that's the procedural direction we need to move. The technical direction we need to move in is, I think the civilian marketplace is actually ahead of us in many ways. You have these commercial war games that can operate on your cell phone. You have war games on your computer where you're flying a B-17 and the guy flying the B-17 next to you is in Germany, and the guy flying the B-17 below you is in South Africa, and the Messerschmitts coming in to hit you one guy is from the Ukraine and the other guy is from South Korea, but yet you're all playing this game in real time. Well, the military can use that capability and do planning in real time for people dispersed to a lot of different locations. So you can do that much quicker, and you can do that without the intelligence indications of bringing together a lot of folks. The old joke about something's about to happen because pizzas are being delivered to the Pentagon. You also have this commercial marketplace making war games more user-friendly, easier to use. It's 10-year-old news that computer wargame designers say if people have to read the manual, we've failed. We need to design it in such a way that it's so intuitive there doesn't need to be a manual in the first place. Well, if you can create military war games that are that easy to learn and have it run on the desktop computer or your iPhone or something like that, then that's going to lead to a lot more wargaming. Right now, DoD war games tend to be like the old mainframe computers. You know, it takes a long time to do anything, and there's only a few of them, and there needs to be time in the schedule. If you can move technically to an area where you have personal war games, where a individual can play a war game because he had this great idea and he wants to kind of get a back of the envelope feel for the accuracy of that, the efficacy of that idea. Just think of how that speeds up the OODA loop. Just think about how much more innovation you're going to have when you make it that much easier to have insights into innovation. So both those areas, towards more comprehensive war games that almost become peace games, and then more technically enabled war games so they can be easier, more portable, more networked. I think those are the twin directions that wargaming needs to move in.
So ending on a more casual note is, what is one of your favorite wargaming memories in your long, illustrious career, Matt?
Oh, boy, these are great questions. It's are you trying to recruit teachers? I really try to pretend to be modest, and I think I am, but I have this theory that the things that you're really proud of aren't medals or promotions or things like that. They're just times that things happen, and it only happens like this in movies. So I'm working at Maxwell Air Force Base. I do wargaming support for different schools. I worked at their wargaming center, and then the reserves made a mistake and called me up for 10 months to actually go through Air Command and Staff College in residence. And so the end of the year war game, I helped create the year before. And I've been on the Air University Red Team, and I know we're going to win the war game. So, and even though I'm not a pilot, my seminar decides that I'm going to be in charge for the war game. So instead of trying to win, I set as my goal trying to make sure that everybody was involved. So we had a guy from an organization that was about to become the Air Force Research Lab, and I had him go to the library and research, because this game was set a few years in the future, open source technologies that should be available a couple of years in the future. And then I told our operators, you don't get to touch any of the controls, work with your non-operators to explain to them, what you're trying to do and how you're going to do it, and so that they actually hit the keys and really see how the thing would move forward. And I make sure that everybody's involved, and all members of the seminar, including the international officers, are really being productive. Well, the war game is supposed to go through Friday, and the last day of play though is Thursday, because they get the results Friday morning. The war games are that fast, and then come up with their debriefing slides and everything else. So I show up Thursday morning, and in the seminar room is our faculty advisor, one of the guys I recognize from the red team, and some guy I don't recognize. And I'm like, what's going on? And they said, well, we'll tell you when everybody else shows up. So the whole seminar shows up, and the faculty member says, this week you've been playing against these two guys. They have been your red team. They convinced me last night that given what you've done so far in the game, they have nothing they can do today militarily that would have any impact on you guys. So they're here to offer their surrender. And oh, by the way, you have the rest of the day off. And so I'm like, so they made a big show of formally surrendering and everything else. The faculty member said, okay, we're going to do the debriefs at 8:30 tomorrow morning. Be back then. And it's like 8:55, and I'm done with school that day. And so it didn't get in my performance reports, didn't get a decoration, wasn't mentioned anywhere, but that was probably the proudest I've ever been of doing a war game.
Well, thank you, Matt. I want to thank you on the behalf of Georgetown and Georgetown's Wargaming Society for your wonderful lecture on the MVPs of wargaming history. This will be recorded for YouTube and posted later tonight. I'll send out the link via Twitter and social media and email to you, Matt. And thank you for the audience for staying with us through our technical challenges, on being patient and being engaged throughout the talk. So see you next week, next time for Maurice's presentation on storytelling and wargaming. And thank you again, Matt.
My pleasure. And great questions. Thank you all very much. And please email me if you have any